In the last section, we talked about the right of nature, which grants each person the right to any given thing. In this section, we'll talk about what Hobbes calls the law of nature. The law of nature, he says, is a rule which prohibits you from endangering yourself. He gives an argument for this rule, that is, an argument that it is a rule, and the argument goes like this. Premise 1. Self-preservation is our fundamental motivation. His claim here is just this, that at the end of the day, what a person pursues first and foremost is always her own survival. Premise 2. If self-preservation is your fundamental motivation, then you shouldn't endanger yourself. Well, since we've just established that self-preservation is your fundamental motivation, and this implies that you shouldn't endanger yourself, the conclusion follows. You shouldn't endanger yourself. Now, notice that this argument takes us from a description of what is the case to a prescription about how one ought to behave. So he says self-preservation is your fundamental motivation. That's a description. And he concludes that you shouldn't endanger yourself. That's a prescription. It's a move from what is the case to what ought to be the case. It's a move from a description to a prescription. And remember that this is a key moment in any moral or political philosophy. The moment when you start from a premise about how things are and you move to a conclusion about how they should be. I'll remind you here of something we've talked about before, which is the distinction between prescription and description. And the example we used was of a doctor and a patient, and the doctor tells the patient that the patient is infected by a virus. And the patient says, well, what should I do? And the doctor says, you should take these 3 pills. Again, the claim that you are infected with a virus is a description of how the world is. It says this is what's the case. The claim that you should take these 3 pills is a prescription. It's saying how the world should be. It's not trying to describe it. It's saying what the patient ought to do. Well, this is always a key moment in moral or political philosophy, because in moral or political philosophy, we're told how things should be. And it's hard to establish claims about what should be. And it's especially hard to infer them from claims about how things are. So when that happens, you should take note. And again, this is where it happens. So the premise that ties what is the case to what should be the case is this second premise, where Hobbes says, if self-preservation is your fundamental motivation, then you shouldn't endanger yourself. Okay, so this raises a question. If you shouldn't endanger yourself, what should you do specifically? Okay, remember, in the state of nature, that is the state without government, you're in a war of all against all. It's a giant bloodbath. So if there's this fundamental law that says you shouldn't endanger yourself, it raises the question, what should you do? Remember, the war of all against all is incredibly brutal. It's a giant bloodbath. Well, if you shouldn't endanger yourself, and the war of all against all is a giant bloodbath, it seems clear that you should end the war of all against all. That's the way to avoid endangering yourself. And this raises the question, how should you do that? And that's what we'll talk about next time.